Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's INDEP event with Cecilia Rikap and Edemilson Paraná on reclaiming digital sovereignty. Cecilia has a PhD in economics from the Universidad de Buenos Aires and is an associate professor in economics and the head of research at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University's College of London. And Edemilson Paraná is an associate professor in the Department of Social Sciences at Lund University, Finland. And there he leads the research group on economy, technology, and society. And Cecilia and Edemilson today are going to talk a little bit about a white paper they co-authored titled Reclaiming Digital Sovereignty. And I'm going to skip the big description. Over to you, Cecilia. Take it away.
Sure. So, hi everyone. It's great to be here. I'm going to share a few slides with you. The first ones will simply set the scene, and then I will go straight to our proposal. I think that if we start by asking ourselves why shall we reclaim digital sovereignty, and actually what we mean by digital sovereignty, because if you think about it, the term these days is even used by NVIDIA, Amazon, the right in Europe and elsewhere. So everybody's speaking about sovereignty and digital sovereignty. And I think that we can go from the narrow definition of sovereignty, definitions that do not make sense in today's capitalism, and that certainly are very, very far away from any form of idea of democratically organizing and planning our societies, towards a more democratic way of thinking about sovereignty. So the narrower one would be we discuss about sovereignty and connected it directly to the territory. So whatever happens inside a country, that will be sovereign. And this is what NVIDIA, Amazon, and so on use when they say we are installing a data center in your country, and therefore that will be sovereign because it will be in your sovereign territory. But what they are not saying there is that when they install a data center, the data center becomes a sort of military base and nobody can get access to it. On top of that, that data center, this was confessed by a Microsoft employee to the French Congress, because of the Cloud Act. Even if the data center is installed in whatever country, US companies are obliged to share the data with the US government if the US government requires it on the basis of what is stated on the Cloud Act. So clearly, this is already misleading. So for some, sovereignty is synonymous to national. So if instead of having a US company installing a data center in, let's say, France, to continue with the example, we have a French company installing a data center on French soil, that will be sovereign. But the thing is, and France doesn't have actually any company that is running such a business, but Germany does, for instance, SAP. So to keep it concrete, to keep it real, let me use the example of SAP. SAP installs a data center in Germany, but that data center will still be running like a military base. What's inside that data center, the type of services that are provided, what technology is developed, what data is captured and stored in that data center, all that will be beyond the capacity of the government or the citizens to govern, to decide, to organize. And this is why, in the end, these two ways of portraying sovereignty are not only narrow, but also misleading. And this is why when we in our report and more broadly speak about expanding or reclaiming digital sovereignty, we're thinking of sovereignty from a different perspective. What we have in mind is not sovereignty in the sense of where the technology is installed or the nationality of the company that is offering the technology. We're not even referring here only to the use of the technology. Another way in which the idea of digital sovereignty has been misappropriated is by referring to the possibility of the whole country to use a technology. And I will come back to this later on. But it's not only about using a technology, what we mean when we say expanding digital sovereignty, but above all, the capacity to collectively and democratically decide what technologies we get, for what purposes, who develops the technology, for whom that technology is being developed, and also the type of technology and data that therefore we don't want to develop. So deciding is about empowering people, citizens, and governments to democratically decide about technology, about the production of technology. The lack of all this has led to obvious consequences way beyond the digital sphere. One of them is the destruction of the public sphere. Is the fact that there is no democratic space for deliberation today. Social media, I don't need to explain probably to the people in this call the effects that it has had in amplifying extreme right discourses and other discourses that generate more attention and traction while silencing other types of ideas or thoughts. But this is only the tip of the iceberg, actually, because the states themselves are losing autonomy, which is directly reflected in the complete lack of spaces for citizens to actually have some form of self-governing power. And we can go and see many examples. Let me start by examples from, for instance, the UK or Germany, where governments themselves are signing agreements to use technologies that are offered by these companies as black boxes and to directly migrate to the cloud of an Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and so on. So it's not only that peripheral states are becoming dependent. This is something, the dependence on foreign technology controlled by corporations has been imprinted in the history of peripheral countries, of peripheral economies. But part of the novelty today is that this is even extended today to other countries that used to be at the core, like Germany or the UK. So it's not only that there is an extended economic dependency where big tech companies are controlling the whole global value chain for digital technologies beyond ownership. So even if they are not the only ones developing these technologies, they still control all the universities, startups, other companies like SAP itself, and many others that participate in the ecosystem. And I can then further unpack this if there are questions about it. But really, we're also seeing a scenario where even the local companies like SAP are complicit actors. They will definitely not help governments in their search for expanding democratic digital sovereignty in the way that I have introduced it 1 second ago. And this is also pushing governments to face what can be described as a form of twin extractivism. Because on the one hand side, a few companies from the US and secondarily China are capturing data and also capturing knowledge that is produced globally in global science technology innovation networks. But and of course, use all that knowledge to profit more, to capture more value from all those that, like the German and the UK government, depend on their technologies. But also, it generates a further extraction of nature. Because one of the ways in which governments have been trying to expand their digital sovereignty has been mistakenly by trying to attract data centers and trying the installation of data centers from these companies on top of what I was describing before also generates a systematic extraction of tons of electricity and water. So, and of course, disrupts completely the socio environmental spaces where they are installed. So the communities that are living around them get also severely disrupted. So basically, it is in this context that we see governments around the world trying to do a few things to counterbalance the power of these companies. However, now we are seeing decisive moves from the US government and big tech companies themselves against all forms of regulation. And this needs to be included in the discussion about expanding digital sovereignty, because while at the same time we think of moving forwards, actually there is a push that there is a movement pushing us exactly in the opposite direction, because governments around the world are being threatened by the US government, by Trump directly, that if they dare to charge any form of digital tax or levy digital services legislation and so on, there will be retaliations from the US government, something that the companies themselves have been pushing Trump to do. So this is another episode of the very much entangled alliance that big tech companies have with the US government. And I say another episode because before what these companies were pushing for during, for instance, Biden administration was to regulate AI uses, but not to speak about what the responsibilities in terms of the production of AI. So basically, by diverting the conversation to simply regulate the uses of AI, they were making sure that themselves, as the producers of AI, were not being regulated. In a scenario that is more favorable to these companies, they are pushing one step further and saying, hey, in fact, not even regulate the AI uses. And governments around the world are suffering today the direct threats of companies like Meta that are trying to prevent them from even regulating AI uses, which is the minimum that a government should do if it wants to try to keep a minimum degree of digital sovereignty. And I can comment more on this later on. But let me say, so there is one more aspect to highlight before we can get into our proposal, because a lot of the discussion about sovereignty these days is also misleadingly understood as the expansion of what has been dubbed digital public infrastructure. Digital public infrastructure is a very misleading term because it refers to the public sector, yes, and connects the public sector with infrastructure, but it has nothing to do with data centers or the undersea cables or the satellites that are needed to store the data, transport the data, and process it. What digital public infrastructure refers to are basically three services: digital IDs, e-payments or an e-payment platform, and a platform for or software for exchanging data. And what Bill Gates over here and other foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and Carnegie Foundation, the World Bank, and of course these companies directly. But when we say Bill Gates was sitting on the table with the King of England during the visit of Trump, representing Microsoft. So although he might be just seen as an old guy sitting in his foundation, completely detached from Microsoft, he's still part of Microsoft board and directly intervening. So when we see there, for instance, someone like Bill Gates discussing with Modi from India about digital public infrastructure, what these governments are actually being told is, hey, just advance your digital services. And then, of course, those digital services will need to be stored somewhere. We need to be run in processors. And who can offer all that? Well, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and so on. And once every single citizen in peripheral countries has adopted these services, it also means that they will already be fully integrated data subjects, because still millions around the world are not digitally included. So pushing the governments to generate these nationwide services is also a way to expand the data subjects that these companies will then be able to control and profit from. So what shall be done instead? And here I will go straight to our presentation and say that what we actually want to build is a public-led, people-centered, democratic, and ecological digital value chain. A lot of things need to be changed. And to explain it, I will go step by step, because I think that it will be clearer than just summarizing it from the start. So be patient, and please feel free to ask if you have any doubts. On the left side of the screen, you have a very stylized digital value chain today, where we recognize that the design of AI chips is disproportionately concentrated in the hands of NVIDIA. At the level of the foundry, the manufacturing of the semiconductors is the Taiwanese company TSMC, the one that controls most of the market. And then through their clouds, the concentration of data centers, data, AI talent, and so on, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have a capacity to control beyond ownership. They control the companies that are developing AI models, the companies that are also developing applications that are powered by those AI models, and all sorts of companies that are developing digital services and sooner or later will be offering those services on Amazon, Microsoft, or Google Cloud's marketplaces, because their clouds are not only spaces where a company or an organization can store their data or use processing power, they are also marketplaces. Just like Amazon.com is a marketplace, Amazon Web Services is another marketplace, but for digital technology. So ultimately, where everything is exchanged, produced, and consumed, are spaces, are virtual spaces controlled by a few tech companies. And these virtual spaces are the ones that must be replaced if we want to have an alternative ecosystem that doesn't depend on them. So the proposal that I'm going to introduce is a proposal that can be applied at different levels. It can be something that it's an alternative ecosystem only for a specific industry. It can be thought of as an alternative ecosystem at the level of a country. It can also be thought of an alternative ecosystem for the public sector. So all the digital services that the public sector is consuming can be offered through this alternative ecosystem that I will describe in 1 second. And we can actually think of a solution that is even narrower and say, let's think, for instance, of public education. Maybe it's feasible to start creating an alternative ecosystem that is public-led, people-centered, democratic, and ecological, but only for technologies that will be used by elementary schools from the public sector. This is by thinking of this solution at different scales, we can address the question of how expensive it will be and also how feasible. Because if I will portray the alternative and explain the details in 1 second, but if I say, okay, from tomorrow onwards, we are going to create all this technology that will be available for every industry, every organization around the world, of course, it will be insanely expensive and it will be impossible to afford it in the short run, or probably ever, by a single government or a multilateral organization and so on. But the way to answer to this is that this same solution can be started as a prototype for specific sectors and specific areas within the public administration. And this is crucial because think of schools. Public schools are using Google Suite, are using Facebook to communicate things to the parents, kids, and all the effect that it has on childhood and on teenagers, the addiction that is generated by social media and so on. And these schools are more and more adopting the technologies offered by these companies. So if you think, for instance, of education as an alternative, we only need to think of the development of an alternative ecosystem for public education. And it can even be applied only at one city at a time. So it will not be that expensive. And the investment and the time and the people needed to develop it will be totally affordable, even by a municipal government. So this to start with perhaps the financial part of the proposal. But what is the proposal about? So as much as we would like to see all this technology being only developed in public spaces and remaining a commons for everyone, we cannot go from zero to hero and pretend that we are not living under capitalism and that governments around the world will still want to see markets, still want companies to do something and so on. So how can we make sure that these companies occupy a space in the ecosystem that is not the driving seat? That doesn't imply that they are the ones that are deciding, calling the shots of what technology we get and profiting the most, but instead that communities are the ones that profit more. So basically, we have focused on the key bottlenecks of this ecosystem or value chain. And in these bottlenecks, we propose public solutions. One, of course, is physical infrastructure. It's impossible to think of an alternative if, in the end of the day, that alternative needs to be stored and run on a data center that is owned by a big tech company. So public data centers run, for instance, through state-owned enterprises with boards that are democratically composed can be an alternative to storing and processing these services inside a private big tech company. But this is only one part of where the bottlenecks can be found. Because let's say we have these data centers and we train a model there that is developed by public scientists and so on. But then that model needs to be made available and for other organizations to run it and use it. And the cloud has become very attractive because it can be accessed from everywhere in the world. All the services are centralized in one place. And therefore, it's easier for users to get everything inside the same place. So, this is why we think that there should also be a similar public space, a public marketplace, a public, more than a marketplace, a public economy online, where we will have at the same time services being offered, services being shared as open source also. So in the case of services being offered, let's think, for instance, of a cybersecurity software for schools. Well, that cybersecurity software for schools will be offered on a publicly run marketplace. It will need to run on public infrastructure. And if it's a company that is offering it, will sell it on this online marketplace that will be run also publicly. So in this way, we can have, first of all, the public physical infrastructure, then a space where the services can be shared and exchanged. That space should also include open source foundation models and universal platforms. A search engine is extremely important for our societies to be left in private hands. So search engines, for instance, are an example of the type of universal platform or infrastructural foundational platform that should be also offered publicly and not left in the hands of privates. But then we can have, as I was saying, a specific software, a specific applications that can be developed by privates, but that will be all exchanged on a marketplace that will be run publicly. The third piece of this alternative ecosystem is a digital technologies R&D agency, because we think that there is also a need to think of the technologies of the future. And if we want to really direct the evolution of digital technologies to keep them within planetary boundaries, the fundamental technologies need to be developed publicly. And the way to do it is basically looking at all the people that are these days in universities and in public research organizations that are in a scattered way developing and thinking about these technologies and offering all of them a common space to work together. You may know that OpenAI developed GPT-4 with hundreds of people, plus people from Microsoft, plus others that were also testing and so on. So you really need a lot of people working together to develop foundation models, also these universal platforms. So basically, and just to wrap up, we see that an alternative to this big tech controlled digital value chain can start and end with the public sector. The public sector can be the one that is demanding, so procurement occupies a key role in our proposal. And the public sector should also at the same time be the one funding, financing, and leading in democratic boards and spaces the physical infrastructure, open source foundation models, and universal platforms. And on top of all this infrastructure, we can think of a marketplace for computing services that will run following the rules, the regulations, and the technological priorities that should be discussed publicly. In the proposal, there are other things. For instance, collective buying of semiconductors. We cannot think of, for instance, Europe tomorrow being capable of designing and manufacturing frontier semiconductors. One also needs to be very realistic about the technological capabilities of the different regions in the world, but it's way better to purchase collectively to get better deals and to negotiate better with these companies. So this is why we thought of collective buying. And then just one additional thing to say, when we think about developing digital services or AI models, of course, this requires data. And there is a need to think of forms of data solidarity that are neither the ways of thinking of data as individual property rights of the people creating it, which is not only very individualistic, but also unrealistic, because most of the data is the side effect or is the product of social relations. Think of an exchange on Amazon.com, or think, for instance, even when you make a post on social media and people like it, this is reflecting a social relation. So who owns that data ultimately? But this is not to say that everyone should just hand in their data to without knowing what that data will be aimed at. Totally the contrary. We think of spaces of data solidarity as spaces where, above all, citizens are all informed about what their data will be used for, what type of data is being harvested. They can also collectively decide about what data will be harvested and what data will not be harvested, and also decide what uses of their data they want to authorize. And on that basis, build data pools or forms of or data sets that are collectively created with conscious from the individuals. And of course, there are other data sets that are not individuals or personal data sets, such as climate data, and part of the services can also be based on these alternative data sets, and one should also remember that. So yeah, the proposal, and just to finish, is summarized in this report. Although the five of us are featured here as lead authors, actually these proposals are the outcome of collaborative work that was done, non-paid collaborative work by around 100 different people spread around the world. And we all shared some ideas, and then the five of us, our role was basically to try to synthesize all that in a more or less coherent form. This is also why, if you read the report, there will be tons of proposals, and there are many more things to discuss. For us, it was also in itself an exercise of democratic planning, and I think that this is, and it's very nice to be presenting this output here, because it also gives us the chance to say a bit more about how we organize the work, and that this report, although again it has our names here at the front page, is actually the result of a lot of collaborative work that is listed in the last page of the report also, if you want to see all the people that contributed. Yeah, and that would be it in terms of our presentation. Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks a lot. I think we stopped the recording here.